In the beginning of Nun Zayin Amud Aleph, the Gemara had mentioned a halacha regarding Hilchos Shabbos, and the Gemara now has to clarify, because the Gemara on its surface level is very difficult to understand. The Gemara had said, Gufa, Amar Rabbi Chanan Rav Yochanan, Heniach basa agabi kacholim. If on Shabbos you put a steak on the coals, so hipich by chayiv, hipich by potter. If you flip it over, then you're chayiv, but if you don't, you're potter. So it's a pella. If I put the steak on the coals, why am I not chayiv for cooking? Why do I have to flip it over? So the Gemara speaks it out. It's an obvious problem. The Gemara says, Hey Chidam, I don't understand the case. If we're talking about a case where the fire is so low that if you don't flip it over, it'll not cook. Meaning, maybe the case is that you put it on the fire, but the fire is so low, it won't cook by the end of Shabbos. So then it's pshita. Then of course, if I put a steak on the fire, but the fire won't cook it, then of course I'm not chayiv. It's a davar pashut. And el diloyet mahapich by nami have a bishul. And if we're talking about the average case, which is a fire where even if you don't flip it over, it's going to cook, then am I loy mechayiv? Then what do I have to flip it over for? I mean, what exactly is the situation where I'm only chayiv for flipping it over? So it says the Gemara loy tzricha diloy hapich bei have a bashul mitzarecha kemachal ben deresai v'chemahapich bei bashul mishnei tzadim kemachal ben deresai. The case is as follows. If I leave it on the fire, and the fire is so intense that it'll cook it entirely, then of course I'm chayiv. It's no shayla. The case is where the fire is so low, it'll only cook one side kamachal ben deresai. Let's say machal ben deresai is a third of the way cooked, like Rashi says, a third of the way cooked. It'll only cook one side. If I flip it over, it'll cook both sides kamachal ben deresai. The halacha is cooking one side kamachal ben deresai and the other side completely raw is not considered cooking. So if I leave it on the fire, it'll cook that flat side kamachal ben deresai. It's not going to be chayiv unless you flip it over and you cook both sides kamachal ben deresai. What? It's probably very rare. It's probably very, very rare. It says the Gemara.
But if you cook one side, you can cut it off and eat that side.
But that's not enough. Cooking through the steak, it's only considered cooked if it's both sides. Kamachal ben deresai. Amarava v'im nitzla by k'rogoygeris mitzad echad makom echad. Let's say if I leave it on the fire, one groigeris, which is a dried fig's size. It's a dried fig size, let's say a circle. Yeah. One dried fig will cook fully, meaning if I leave the steak on the fire, one area the size of a dried fig will cook fully. Not past macham in their side. Then I'm chayiv. Meaning, you don't have to cook the entire steak. As long as you cook one fig's worth, a dried fig's worth, whatever the volume of that is, 2 ounces, whatever it is, then you're chayiv. Says the Gemara, the implication is, let's say a dried figs is a 2-inch diameter, a 2-inch circle. Let's say it's a 2-inch circle. I'm only chayiv if I cook a 2-inch circle. Let's say I don't cook a 2-inch circle. I cook 3/4 of an inch over here, and then like the fire is weird, so it gets like 3/4 of an inch over here, and then an inch to the right, another 3/4 of an inch below, 3/4 of an inch. Meaning, I put it together, it's a groigeris, but it's not a groigeris in one spot. The implication is that you're not chayiv. It has to be a groigeris in one spot to be chayiv v'chatas.
This sheet is in contradiction to the vendor.
No, it's not. No, it's not. What are we talking about? Machal ben deresai is one discussion. That's if you cook machal ben deresai on one side, you have to flip it over. We're not talking about machal ben deresai. I'm talking I cook it fully. If you cook it fully, even on one side, then you're chayiv. So the point is that as long as it's a groigeris size, then you're chayiv. Says the Gemara, you only chayiv if you cook it one spot the size of a groigeris, but we're not going to combine together multiple spots to make a groigeris. Meaning, if let's say a groigeris, like I said, is 2 inches in a circle, it's only if you have 2 inches in one spot. But if I have an inch over here and then an inch in another spot, we don't combine it together. Here's the problem. That makes sense. The problem is the following Mishnah. The halacha is that if you drill a hole, a tiny hole in the wall, you're chayiv. Why? Why am I chayiv? So I could use that hole to keep stuff in. And if I could use the hole to keep stuff in, it's a baina. It's a baina issue. It's like making a small little cubby. Let me ask you a question. The Gemara says one hole. Let me ask you a question. What could you keep in one hole? So the Gemara says, mistama nothing. So what does it mean? It must be not one hole, because one hole is too small. A couple holes together are combined together. So you see from here that you combine together a couple spots. So says the Gemara, it can't be one small hole in one small spot. What could I use that for? It has no purpose. Elalav, it must be referring to shnayim or shloshim ekaimis. 2 or 3 holes next to each other. The chazi litziruf, and you see you combine it together. So too over here, I should be able to combine together a groigeris of cooked food in different spots. Because mistama, the one hole, can't be a tiny hole. What's a tiny hole going to do for you? So says the Gemara, it's not true. It's taka one hole. We don't combine together. You need the shear. We don't combine together pachas mikashir in multiple places. So what is the one hole used for? I'll tell you what it's used for. You could put your key in. If I need to, let's say, hang my keys, I put as long as it's the size of the key, the teeth of the key, I could keep it in the wall. So that's what it's used for. So you assume that a tiny hole has no purpose and it must be combining together multiple holes. Who says? Says the Gemara, loy l'makom echad, dechazi lebava daklida, and it's the size of the tooth of a key, so it could be hold a key. Okay. So that version was that you're only chayiv if it's one spot. We asked a kasha from this brisa, and we said, no, the brisa is talking about one hole, and it's big enough for a key. This version, the Gemara has a slightly different version. Ikeda Amri, the brisa says as follows, Amarava, that the brisa actually, according to this version, says that you do not need to cook a groigeris in one spot. You can combine together multiple spots to make a groigeris when it comes to cooking. Amr Levina Levashi, instead of a kasha, now it's a raya. Afananami tanina. I have a raya to this that we combine together multiple spots because the brisa says, the Mishnah says, Hakidech kol shu chayiv. If you drill any amount on Shabbos, you're chayiv. Hey chidami, what's the case? If it's just one hole, koshel my chazi, what is it used for? El lab shashel mekaimis, the chazal tzirif, it must be referring to 2 or 3 spots, and you see it's combined together, so it's chazal tzirif. So Gemara says, loy. And so you see, it's a raya that we combine together. The Gemara rejects it. No, really, it's talking about one hole, and we don't combine together. And what's the one hole used for? Used for the key. Okay, good. Weiter in the Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Tan Rabbanon, Ilu nemar asher takriv laHashem lo yiseh chametz. If the pasuk would have just said these words, asher takrivu laHashem lo yiseh chametz, hayisi omer ein li ela b'lo yiseh chametz ela kometz bolvad. I would say that you're only chayiv for chametz if you make the kometz chametz. Right, the kmitza is what's put on the mizbeach. If the pasuk had said that lashon, I would say that you're only chayiv for making the kmitza chametz. Mincha menayin. In other words, how do I know that I'm chayiv for making the entire mixture chametz before the kmitza is separated? So basically, let me just explain. You have the entire mincha. You separate the kmitza, and the rest is the shirayim. So we had 2 days ago a source that the shirayim, you're over in Isser Chametz. And I know that the kmitza is also going to be in Isser Chametz. How do I know that you're over in Isser Chametz if you make the whole thing before you separate the kmitza also? Meaning maybe you're only Isser Chametz when you separate the kmitza, and that becomes chametz. But before you separate the kmitza, maybe there's no Isser Chametz in making the entire thing chametz. Maybe not. So it says the Gemara. So that's the Gemara. Tamaloi mar mincha. The pasuk says mincha. Mincha means the entire mixture. If you make it chametz, you're over a lav. Okay. Shar minchas minai. And how do I know this applies to other minchas? Because this pasuk is by minchas machvas. How do I know it applies to all minchas? Tamaloi mar kol ha mincha. All minchas are in the same halachas. Asher takrivu laHashem. Another drasha. Keshera v'loy psula. There's only an isser of chametz if it's a kosher carbon. Let's say it's puzzle anyway. So I'll make it, Mr. Losh, you're the kohen in this case, you're kneading the dough, and then for whatever reason, you take it out of the azara, or it becomes tameh. It's already puzzle. It was never roy. Then you let it sit and it turns into chametz, there's no isser. There's only isser chametz if it's roy. If it's not roy, then there's no isser chametz. Mikana amru. Hamachmitz is akshera chayiv is apsula potter, and this is the source of the halacha that only if you make a valid mincha into chametz are you chayiv. But if it's already puzzle, if it was puzzle mitchila, if it was never roy, then that's not the iser. No, why? What do you say? What's the iser? If it's puzzle, then there's no iser chametz. There's no iser elchas. That's not a carbon mincha that the Torah asks. Says the Gemara, Israel Abbas is two different Isurim. Boy Rav Papa Sakasha, Chimtza v'yotzis v'chazer v'chimtza mahu. Interesting shayla. We said before a case, you make a carbon mincha, before it's even a dough, you take it out of the azaras. Right away it's already puzzle. There's no Isser of chametz. What about this case? What if Mr. Lord is making it, he turns into chametz over the lav. Then he takes it out, then brings it back in, then bakes it. So we said that kneading the dough, you're over a lav, baking is the over a lav. So over here, it's now puzzle. By the time he gets to the second act, it's already puzzle. But it wasn't puzzle at the beginning. Meaning, it's not like it was puzzle matchila. It was a regular chametz, it was a regular mincha. He made it into chametz, over a lav. Then he takes it out of the azara, then brings it back, and then he does another act on it. He bakes it, or he shapes it, whatever it is. So the question is, do we say that because it was taken out of the azara in between, it becomes puzzle, and then future acts of chametz don't apply? Or no, it started off, the first act of chametz, it was already roy, and therefore the isser could be chal on the second time. Says the Gemara, do we say kiven diyatzis lebi yaitz v'chadar machmitz loy mechayev lemishu machmitz acher machmitz? Oy dilma kiven the chimtza pasal yaitz lemahani bei v'chadar machmitz me mechayev lemishu machmitz acher machmitz. You definitely chayev the first one. The question is the second one. Teku that we're not sure about. Another shayla. Boy Rav Mari chimtza beroishay shal mizbeach mahu. Interesting shayla. You go up to the top of the mizbeach with the kmitza in your hand. And then, right before you put it on, you let it sit until it turns into chametz. So the question is, do we say, kmitza in your hand, you go to the top of the mizbeach, and then you let it sit in your hand until it turns into chametz? So do we say, it's chametz, or do we say, once you got to the top of the mizbeach, you already, it's like game over. It's like ilu, you already brought it, so there's no isser chametz at that point. Or do you say, no, kol zman, that it's not on the fire, you could be over isser chametz? Do you say, well, you already brought it? You didn't actively put it on the fire. You're already on top of the mizbeach, right? It's ki'ilu, it's makriv. Or perhaps a lack of burning is a lack of an act, and therefore it's not done yet. Teku, we're not sure about. Okay.
Why would you think so? Being on top of the mizbeach,
We find certain halachas that once it's already on top of the mizbeach, like you don't take it down, right? If it was puzzle, so you see that there's some sort of musig, it's already came out, it's done. I don't know. The shayla is a bit of a strange shayla to me, but okay. Says the Gemara Hashed and afkalim kol mincha asher takrivu lamali. We said before the word kol mincha includes all menachos. So what do we do with asher takrivu Hashem? So the Gemara says miboyle l'kidetanya. Look at the words because this is important. Asher takrivu l'rabos minchas nisachim l'chimutz. Divrei Rav Yossi Haglili. The names are also important. Rav Yossi Haglili says that it includes minchas nisachim, that you're not allowed to make minchas nisachim chametz. Why would I think minchas nisachim would be different? Because minchas nisachim are entirely burnt. Maybe the isser of chametz only applies to part that's eaten by the kehanim, but the minchas nisachim, which are entirely burnt, maybe there's no isser chimutz. No. Says Rav Yossi Haglili, important to know the names, Rav Yossi Haglili says, it includes minchas nisachim. That's what this pasuk does, that if you make minchas nisachim chametz, you're over a lot. Comes Rav Akiva, he says, the Rabbis lechem aponim, l'chimutz. Rav Akiva says it's to include the lechem aponim. The showbread, by the way, it's a bit of a misname. It wasn't bread. It was really the show matzah. The showbread was not really bread. It was not chametz. It was shaped. It was probably the thick, it was like the thick teimani matzahs. So Rabbi Yossi says it's to include minchas nesachim. Rabbi Akiva says it's to include lechem aponim. Here's the issue with both of them. Let's go through each one. The first one is to include minchas nesachim. Let me ask you a question. In order for something to become chametz, what do you have to add to it? You need flour and water. Now, the average mincha, you added water to, because if you don't add water, how are you going to make it into a dough? Minchas nesachim had 3 times the amount of oil as the average mincha. The Gemara at this point presumes if you have that much oil, you don't need water. But if you don't add water, it can't become chametz. So you're telling me there's an issa deraisa of turning into chametz. Practically, how is it chametz if it's just oil and flour? Oil and flour is not going to come into chametz. Says the Gemara, minchas esachem me perishem. Go to the next page. Ume peris in machmitzim. If it's just oil and flour, and the Gemara says the only reason why this could be oil and flour is because it's 3 times the amount of oil by the minchas esachem as the average mincha. If there's so much oil, then then maybe there's then how could it become mechametz? So the Gemara answers, Amrish Lakish, Omer Rav Yossi Agli, Rav Yossi Agli used to say, Minchas Esachem Akvil B'mayim Ksher. Rav Yossi Agli used to say, you're allowed to add water to the Minchas Esachem. So the point is, if you add water, which you're allowed to do, now I'm not saying it's needed, but if let's say the kohen feels that the oil is just not making a good dough, and he adds a little bit of water, there's an isser of making chametz. Good. Now from here is where it gets a little bit tricky. Okay. Rav Akiva was the one who says, again, Rav Yossi says that the pasuk is to include minchas nesachim. Rav Akiva says it's to include the lechem aponim, the showbread. Here's the issue: the showbread was used with a basin. It was used with the dry ingredients in a kli that was meant for dry ingredients. Rav Akiva's shita is that the kalim for dry ingredients were not kaddish. They were never niskadish. The shemen hamishcha, according to Rav Akiva, the kalim for dry were never niskadish. They were never placed with the shemen hamishcha. If they were never placed with the shemen hamishcha, then how could it become chametz? The isser of chametz only applies to something that's kaddish. According to Rav Akiva, the lechem aponim, because it was with dry ingredients only, it was used with the kalim for dry ingredients, which means it never became kaddish with those kalim. Those kalim were never anointed with the anointing oils. They're not holy, and therefore the showbread is not holy until it was placed on the shulchan. And at that point, it's too late. Meaning, it's like these are the steps. You could only become, the isser of chametz only applies if it's kaddish. It's only kaddish after it's placed in a klishares. But Rav Akiva holds that the dry ingredients were never niskadish, as we'll see in a moment. So the problem is, how could Rav Akiva say that there's an isser of chametz on the lechem aponim? How? The lechem aponim were not kaddish until they were already baked. Says the Gemara, lechem aponim midas yavishi. Wasn't it used with only dry ingredients? Now, yeah, by the way, no, so it was actually entirely dry. Yeah, so later on the Gemara is going to talk about this. Yeah, the lechem aponim are not brought with oil, and therefore are not placed in the bowl. The only temple vessel used in the preparation is isaron. Flour is measured. I don't know how they.
Flour, and you put it into an oven. It's not going to. You're going to get.
Yeah, it's funny. I was listening to a shir yesterday, and he said the Gemara is going to talk about this, but I don't think the Gemara talks about it today yet. I guess we'll get to it. Most minchas are brought with oil, but it says this is not brought with oil. Okay, and the point is maybe even if there's a little bit of oil added, but it was used in a dry measuring cup, so the cup was not niskadish. So the point is it wasn't kaddish. Even if you tell me that a little bit of water or oil was added to push it, make a dough, but it was used in the dry measuring cup. And the dry measuring cups, yavesh, the kli yavesh, the measuring cups for dry materials, according to Rabbi Akiva, were never anointed. It's based on a pasuk. I don't know why, but it's based on a pasuk. Because the pasuk basically says that by the kalim for the wet ingredients, it says osam, only they. Rabbi Akiva darshans to the exclusion of dry. They were never niskadish, which means if it's not kaddish, it can't become the isser chametz. When does it become kaddish? When it was placed on the shulchan. Says the Gemara, the Shamin Rabbi Akiva damar midis yavish le niskadsha. So how could Rabbi Akiva be the one who says that there's an isser of chametz on lechem aponim when the lechem aponim, according to Rabbi Akiva, were never niskadish until they were already baked? So says the Gemara, switch the names around. Rabbi Akiva is not the one who said lechem aponim, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili is not the one who said minchas nesachim. Switch it. Rabbi Akiva is the one who said minchas nesachim, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili is the one who said lechem aponim. You have to switch the names because it doesn't work. Shalach Rabin Mishmeder Rav Yochanan Kachi Atzashal Mishnah. Rav Yochanan said, "This is how you're supposed to read the Mishnah." Ve'epach, switch the names. Asher Takriv was to include something, but the names are reversed. L'Rabbas Lechem Aponim Lechimutz Rav Yossi Aglili. Rav Yossi Aglili is the one who says that it's to include Lechem Aponim, not Rav Akiva, because as we're going to see in a moment, Rav Yossi Aglili Shita is that dry materials were niskadish. Now, they were not niskadish inside and outside like the wet ones, but they were niskadish as well. Therefore, it's possible for the lechem aponim to become Isser Chametz because it's already kaddish. But Rav Akiva oimer l'Rabbis minchas esachim l'chimutz. And Rav Akiva is the one who says minchas esachim. So Rav Yochanan had to switch the names. The Gemara says, "V'az Rav Yochanan tamei," and this is Rav Yochanan shitaso. Dam Rav Yochanan once said, Rav Yossi Aglili, who we just got finished saying, holds that lechem aponim is shayich chimutz because dry materials were kaddish. Rav Yossi Aglili ve'echa mitamid Rav Yishmael amar d'Rav Rav Yossi Aglili, and one of the students of Rav Yishmael said the same thing. Who is the student? Umanu Rav Yoshia. So Rav Yossi Aglili and Rav Yoshia are saying the same thing. What are they saying? The Tanya v'yim shachem ve'yikadesh osam. The pasuk says that Moshe Rabbeinu anointed the wet materials. When I say wet materials, I mean the kalim that are holding wet, like a measuring cup for water or oil or blood. Rav Yoshia Omer midas halach nimshach bein b'fnim b'machutz. Rav Yoshia says like this: liquid measure materials were anointed inside and outside. Midas yavesh nimshachu b'fnim v'lein nimshachu b'chutz. Says Rav Yoshia, like Rav Yoshia Aglili, dry materials were niskadish inside. They were anointed inside, but not the outside. So it's not the same as the wet, but it is kadosh. So Rav Yoshia Aglili is the one who could say that the lechem aponim, which is using a dry material mixing cup, it is kaddish because it's at least anointed in the inside. Rav Yonasan disagrees, and he says like Rav Akiva. Rav Yonasan said, so Rav Yossi Agli, when Rav Yochanan said that Rav Yossi Agli holds like Rav Yoshia, it works out well. They both say it's in kaddish. But Rav Yonasan disagrees. He says, no, midas alach nimshach bibifnim, liquid measures were anointed on the inside, ve'im bachutz, but they were not anointed outside, and midas yavish le'nimshach kol ikar, and dry material measuring cups were not anointed at all. The Gemara says, Teidalach, I'll prove it to you. Sharei in Mikdashos, I'll prove it to you that dry materials used for flour were not kaddish. Dichsiv, because it says regarding the Shtei HaLechem, Mimosh v'yiseichem, Taviu lechem tenufa, Shtayim shnei esunim, Soilas tiena, Chametz teafena, Bikurim laHashem. The pasuk says that the Shtei HaLechem, right? The pasuk says, Moshe says, Taviu lechem tenufa, Shtayim shnei esunim, Soilas tiena, right? You bring 2 isar and a fine flour. They shall be baked. Bikurim laHashem. Then they're bikurim. When are they LaHashem? Meaning, the pasuk says, Te'afena, they're baked, then they're bikurim, then they're holy. Meaning they're only holy after they're baked, not before. Why? Because before they're using measuring cups, and dry measuring cups, they were mixed in dry measuring cups. Dry measuring cups are not niskadish, so they're only kaddish after they're baked, because then they're placed in a kli shares. The Ma'ika Miflagi, what's the machlekes about? So everyone agrees the word osam means that the liquid cups were not the same as the dry cups. The only question is to what extent. Rav Yoshia says osam means that they're not the same in what way? Liquid measuring cups were niskadish inside and outside, and dry measuring cups only inside, but they were kadosh. Rav Yonasan says no. Midas yavish chol, midas chavish cholhi. He says no. Measuring cups that are for dry are completely non-sacred. They're not. They were never niskadish. Ki itzakral midas lachme b'chutz. Osam means that the liquid cups themselves were not niskadish on the outside. Now, one quick point before we finish up this sugya. 2 quick points. Rav Yochanan had to switch the names, and then Rav Yochanan said why? Because he felt that Rav Yossi Aglili holds that lechem aponim were niskadish because they were in a dry cup. Rav Akiva disagrees. And then Rav Yochanan said, this is lishitasai. Why? What's lishitasai? Because he once said that Rav Yossi Aglili and Rav Yoshia hold the same thing. Then he continued talking, and Rav Yonasan disagrees. Doesn't Rav Yonasan and Rav Akiva say the same thing? Meaning, if Rav Yossi Aglili and Rav Yoshia say the same thing, which is that the dry measuring cups were kadosh, why not finish the statement? Say, Rav Yossi Aglili and Rav Yoshia hold one way, and Rav Akiva and Rav Yonasan feel the other way. That seems to be the machlokes. Rav Yoshia says it's niskadish. Rav Yonasan says it's not. Rav Yossi Aglili says that the Shtei HaLechem were kaddish. Rav Akiva says not. So it seems to be it's 2 against 2. So why did he just say that Rav Yossi Aglili and Rav Yoshia agree without saying that Rav Yonasan and Rav Akiva agree? Why not finish the statement? So it says the Gemara. The answer is the answer is because Rav Akiva and Rav Yonasan don't agree fully. They do agree that the dry measuring cups were not kadosh. They argue about the wet measuring cups. According to Rav Yonasan, the measuring cups that were wet were only niskadish on the inside, but Rav Akiva actually disagrees. He says wet measuring cups were niskadish inside and out. So while they agree somewhat, for our discussion, yes, they agree, but they're not full lockstep, and therefore he didn't want to put them in the same boat. Now, the Gemara has 2... Yeah?
So, is it footnote 7? They did use water.
Footnote, which one?
7 on 57b1.
Oh, meaning they use water, but they put it in a dry measuring cup.
It was in a dry measuring cup and saw, and then you took it out.
Yes, okay, that makes sense. That's what I said before. Yeah, meaning they added water, but they mixed it in the dry measuring cup. So because it was mixed in the dry measuring cup, it was not niskadish. Oh, says the Gemara, but wasn't it mixed in the bisa, which is the bowl, vilachu, meaning the Gemara said kasha. You just, a perfect segue from Mr. Lords, that they added some water. So wouldn't it make sense that they mixed it in the bisa? The bisa was the kli that was used for liquid. So wouldn't it make sense that they would mix it in the kli used for liquid? So the Gemara says, perhaps the case is where they mixed it on top of a leather spread, meaning they didn't use a liquid measuring cup, they used a dry measuring cup for whatever reason. You could, meaning they could have used the liquid one, but perhaps they didn't. Okay. By the way, it makes sense not to, because then you avoid the Isser Chametz. Smart, right? Anyway, says the Gemara, wait a minute. Ihachi, de kamerle Rav Yonasan teidalach, shareina mekadeshes, lemaliki going to kaila bisar in the chol. The Gemara has a question. Wait. So you're telling me that there's an option that they didn't use the bisa, they used just like a leather cutting board to mix it in. So then let me ask you a question. Rav Yonasan brought a raya that dry materials are not kaddish because the pasuk says by the shtei halechem it says b'moish v'yiseichem teviu lechem tenufa shtayim shnei sanim soiletz tiyem chametz teafena bikurim l'Hashem, that it's only a kaddish when it's baked, which implies before that it's not kaddish. Why? Because dry measuring cups are not kaddish. I don't understand. Once you're telling me that they could use other things, maybe they didn't use a dry measuring cup at all. Meaning, once you're telling me that they could just use different things, maybe they used a measuring cup from home. Right? Your raya, you bring a raya that is only kaddish when they baked. Why not before? Oh, it must be the dry measuring cups are not kaddish. Well, maybe they didn't use a dry measuring cup. Maybe they didn't use a kli sharetz at all. Maybe taka dry measuring cups are kaddish. And maybe over here, the case is where they brought a measuring cup from home. Once you're telling me that they could just go off script and use whatever they want, so maybe they didn't use kaddish at all. So the Gemara says, no. Hachi hashta. Bishlam bisla kasar achman alavid bisla melishman. No. At least by the bisa, it was never said in the Torah you have to use a liquid measuring cup. So at least they could use solid. They could use the leather cutting board. But over here, El Isaron, Kivad Amar Achmana Avad Isaron V'Kayil Bey, Shavik Isaron the Kaddish V'Kayil Isaron the Chol. But no. But you're telling me that, listen, it's one thing to say that they're going to use a Kli Sharetz, they might use the dry measuring cup as opposed to the liquid measuring cup. But what do you want to say? Maybe they didn't use a Kli Sharetz at all. Maybe they brought a measuring cup from home. You think the Torah says to bring an Isaron, a flour, and they're going to use a measuring cup from home? That's never an option. They're definitely not going to use Chol. You want to say that they wanted to use a Kli Sharetz that was maybe a dry Kli Sharetz, at least it belongs to the Beis Hamikdash, but to use something from home, that's a pal. That was never on the table. Just to finish up, one last discussion. Tanu Rabbanon, Menayin Lamailo. Okay, so basically this Bryce is going to be describing, mamish 2 minutes, the Bryce is going to be describing karbanos, that there's parts that are already meant for God, and the rest is meant for the Kehanim. What if I burn what's meant for the Kehanim for God? Meaning, I take a piece of the chatas that's meant to be given to the kohen and I burn it on the mizbeach. It's a lav. You're not allowed to do this. Yeah, it's a big lav. So it says the Gemara, Minayin l'mayla b'sar chatas. How do I know if I take a basar of the chatas, which is meant to be eaten, I burn on the mizbeach, or basar asham, or basar kachikachim, or basar kachikalim, or memaisar oimer, the leftover of the oimer, or memaisar shtei alechem, or the leftover of the shtei alechem, umi lechem aponim, or from the lechem aponim. Now, what's the lechem aponim? What is it? The lechem aponim, does this really fit in the category? We're listing things that is partially burnt, partially eaten. Isn't the lechem and panim entirely eaten? So how does that fit in the list? The answer is there's the 2 spoons of frankincense. The 2 spoons of frankincense of the lechem aponim is like the emurim. The same way you have emurim, which is meant for God, and the bas of the chatas, which is meant for the kehanim. We look at the 2 spoons of frankincense, that's meant for God. The lechem aponim is meant for the kehanim. If you burn the lechem aponim, it works in this list. Umeshari amincha ashubaloy. So how do you know they're overlapped? Hamalemer ki kol saar v'chol davash loy saktir mimenu ishal Hashem. Kol shemenu l'isham l'Hashem v'baktatir. The pasuk says any leavening or honey that you burn is an iser deraisa to burn it to the mizbech. Kol shemenu l'isham l'Hashem. Including this pasuk is anything that was already burnt, meaning already allocated part of it burnt. Kol shebaktatir. You're not allowed to burn the leftovers, meaning. If you have a carbon that partially is burnt, the part that's not burnt, you're Yisr Lav of burning on the Mizbech. Now the Gemara has one quick point. I told you the lechem upon him, the shtei lechem, they're entirely eaten. They don't have a part of them that's burnt. What do they have? They have the spoons of frankincense. So we're looking at the spoons of frankincense as like the emurim, and the rest that's burnt, the rest that's eaten is like the part of the carbon that's eaten. Is that really how you look at it? Shtei lechem upon yeshim leishim. But Tanya, but doesn't the Brisa say Yatsu Shei Lechem Achaponim She'emem Leishim? I thought the Lechem Aponim is entirely eaten. There's no part of it that's burnt. The answer is Amar Sheshes in Meguva Leishim. There's no part of it itself that's burnt, but a part of the process, the ceremony, i.e., the frankincense spoons, those are burnt, and therefore we look at the Lechem Aponim as one large carbon. The same way you have a carbon that has a murim that's burnt, and then there's basa that's eaten, so to the lechem aponim, it has the frankincense that's burnt, and the actual bread itself, which is eaten by the kehanim.